Hello everyone, I'm Ross and welcome to another recap on the Bible study that I've been doing on Sunday nights. We're in the book of Ruth still, and here's some more life lessons that I want to share with you. I'm going to read the first few verses of the book of Ruth. Now, my wife already told me, Ross, we have to get past the first few verses and go deeper. And it's not because I'm a deep scholar about what's going on, and it's pretty simple because it's a story, but it's just because there's some valuable life lessons that are just contained within this first chapter. I found like 30 or 40, maybe even 50, but I can't remember, lost count, but so many life lessons are wrapped up in this story. It's just phenomenal. And for being such a short book, it has a lot, especially in the first part, in the first chapter, because it's a narrative and it's not telling their story about the dialogue that they have later, because the dialogue doesn't leave a lot more, it doesn't leave a lot to the life lessons that I've found. It doesn't have a lot of life lessons in what they say per their conversations. But the life lessons I have found are found in this narrative, and so I'm going to share 3 more today. I do pray they're a blessing to you. Let me read to you Ruth chapter 1. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. Now, understand that as we read the story, they go to Moab, which is only 50 miles away from Bethlehem, right? It's only 50 miles away. And so when they go to Moab, the famine is not there. So the famine is centralized in Israel. It's not regional, it's just within Israel, and specifically within this area, Bethlehem for sure, which shows us this is an act of God to judge them in this time of Israel's life where they have wavered in following the one true God and worshiping false gods and leaving the true God behind for other things. And so this is a form of judgment, this famine, in this particular story. A judgment of God. As we see throughout Scripture, that famine can be a judgment of God. When you read the prophets, major and minor, they will talk about famine or locusts or disease that comes and how it's a God-sent judgment on the people. So in this case it was, because it didn't spread all the way to Moab. It's only 50 miles away and they weren't experiencing the famine, which leads us to understand that this was a type of judgment on Israel, and specifically the area of Bethlehem. So there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech. Now the other thing is, Elimelech means, my God is king, or God is king. And what's interesting was he doesn't live in accordance of God being his king. So it was a name that he had, but not a life that he lived. And that's a very sad thing, because as I mentioned before previously, we never see him pray about this decision of moving his family and leaving his own countrymen and his own people behind to go to another place during this time of need. And prayer is so big. If you watch any of my videos, you'll know that I've written a book on prayer, that I've made videos on my book of prayer. Each chapter has been made into video format as I read the chapter out loud. But another thing that's interesting, and the rabbis write this, different ones at different times have written this narrative about Elimelech, and that was he was a leader, whether it was a spiritual leader or a social leader, like a city council member or someone the community looked up to. He didn't live up to what he was, he didn't live up to his potential. He didn't live up to his purpose. He was being looked up to as a leader in the community, both maybe spiritually and socially. And he leaves his community behind. Basically, when bad times came, he ran and took his family with him. And that brought fear and discouragement to the people of God that were still there, facing the trial and enduring the famine, while this one that they look up to heads out the door. So there's a lot that comes into play in the life of Elimelech here. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife was Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab, and what did they do? They remained there. The idea that I feel behind the thought of remaining there was they go there permanently. And that's going to lead to one of our life lessons in just a moment. So remember that thought, underline that in your Bible. Verse 3, then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. So once again, he's led his family to a different place, different gods, left his own God behind, left his responsibilities behind, brought his family in a more permanent way to live in Moab, and now they're marrying women of Moabite culture and religion. So you can see how your effect and my effect as men and as fathers plays a role in the life of our families. When we reject God as king and we make these decisions, they carry over to the life of our family, and they carry over long term. And so we need to be very wise and very careful. And like I said, 2 thoughts about prayer. Life is fragile, handle with prayer, number 1. Number 2, a careful decision is a prayerful decision. In other words, when you're making decisions, pray about them. Pray about them. They took 2 wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah. The name of the other was Ruth. Now, Orpah is an interesting name. So is Ruth. Ruth in Jewish culture is a revered name for a woman, a daughter, a baby girl, right? But it's interesting because her name was not Jewish in origin; it was Moabite, because she was a Moabitess. But it's become so revered because of this story in her life that her name has become very precious and very Jewish in nature. Orpah is very interesting, and there's a famous person you've heard of, probably. Her name is Oprah Winfrey, O-P-R-A-H. She was actually named after Orpah, O-R-P-A-H. But when her mom was filling out the birth certificate, she switched the letters accidentally, and named her daughter Oprah instead of Orpah, and now you know the rest of the story. And so it says the name of the wives were Orpah and Ruth, and they dwelt about 10 years. They dwelt in Moab about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. So Naomi, whose name means sweetness or pleasant, we're going to see her name, her life causes her to reject her name and take another name. We'll see that later. But let me give you quickly now 3 life lessons I want to share with you. Number 1, don't sacrifice the permanent on the altar of the immediate. In Western culture, we have this very tragic lifestyle of living for the moment when we're not supposed to live for the moment. We're supposed to live in the moment, but not for the moment. In other words, we don't make decisions on what we can have now. We need to make longer term decisions. Look at that in the financial realm of the Western culture, and you will see that 70+% of families are living paycheck to paycheck. Now, this is not true about every family in that 70 percentile, but most of them are living that way because they're making decisions on what they can have now instead of preparing for the future and living more frugal now to live better later. They're putting everything in now and living for the moment instead of planning for the future. In the case of this story, when I told you, remember the words, they remained there. He took his family to basically permanently live forever in Moab. Everything was on the immediate. What do we need now? We need to survive now. They didn't tough it out. They didn't pray about it. They didn't try to make things work. They literally sacrificed the permanent because he actually had land. He had heritage. He had culture. He had a religion. He had his people, his faith system, everything that Elimelech had, he left behind. He sacrificed the permanent for the immediate. We can't do that, guys. Don't ever live that way. Number 2. When I told this to my group last night, I said, this one is kind of whatever, but I like it. And they really seem to embrace this one. Nothing is forever except eternity. Now, when you're a teenager and you're making decisions, some things seem forever. When maybe you're just entering high school and you've already been in school for a long, long time, and now you're in high school and you got 4 more years of school and you're like, oh my word, 4 more years. Of course it seems like a long time. When you're only anywhere from 14 to 17 years old, anything that's 6 months or longer seems like a very long time based upon your scale of life. Out of 18 or out of 14 years, you've got a whole year or 3 years to be in high school. It seems forever. Why? Because 3 years out of 17 is what? About 20% of your life? So yeah, it seems like a long time. But as you get older, you realize that nothing is forever. These things come and go. I've had financial blessings and financial downturns. I've had jobs that were awesome and then jobs that were, barely making it by and having to work 2 or 3. I've had all these ups and downs in my life, but as you live life and as you read stories out of the Bible, especially this one, you realize one incredible truth: nothing is forever except eternity. Jesus expounded on this when he said, lay up your treasures in heaven, because when you're just living for this world, you're living for temporary status. But when you're when you're laying up treasures in heaven, you're living for the permanent, right? And so nothing is forever except eternity. So make sure when you do make decisions, you're looking at the eternal aspect of what you're doing, because everything we do in this life will echo in eternity. And then the third thing, which is one of the main things we talked about last night, and I'm going to run through it real quick because of time, but life is full of grief. Learn to grieve well. Let me mention to you some of the things that you should grieve. And then I want to encourage you to read a certain book, and I'm going to give you some points. And then I'm going to encourage you to read a certain book on grief that will help you tremendously with this idea. Learn to grieve well. Here's the thought. Here's some losses that occur in our life that we need to learn to grieve. And we don't grieve every loss the same, because every loss is different, but every loss is a loss, okay? So there's a loss of a job, there's going to be some grief there. When you move from one place to another and you lose friends and you lose familiarity, there can be some grieving there. Retirement, there could be some grieving in retirement. Divorce was huge. We talked about this. I centered on this for a little bit more last night than I will now, but divorce, there's a lot of grief. Even if the husband and wife didn't get along at the end and they were just boom, 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 there's still a loss and there's still a grief that has to take place, and we need to learn to grieve these things. What about a disability, or maybe a loss of a limb or an eye or something? When you lose something physically, an arm, a leg, whatever, there needs to be a time of grieving for that, because you did lose something. We lost our home. In January 15th, 2000, we lost our home to a house fire. We were gone to Kentucky. We came back and the house was gone. Years and years later, there's a tornado that swept through that same area of Tennessee, Athens, Tennessee, that the church and the Christian school that we had been a part of to some degree lost their gym, lost their buildings. It was devastating. They had to grieve those things. The death of a pet, of course, loss of friendships and relationships is huge grieving. And then loss of a family member. And in this case, one of the folks last night, why are you talking about grief so much in this Bible story? And I'm like, well, look at the life of Naomi. She lost her home, she lost her friends, she lost her culture, she lost her heritage, she loses her husband, then she loses her sons. Yeah, there's a lot of grief that she had to pour out, but learn to grieve well. Now, there's a book called Good Grief, and it's by Granger Westberg. I believe that's the name, Granger Westberg. And it's an powerful book. It's very small, but very powerful. He's a chaplain, and he basically has been one of the forerunners of developing this thought of, and I'm looking at the book, yeah, Granger Westberg. He developed this understanding of learning to grieve well, and we don't do it in Western culture like we should. First thing about grief, expect it and embrace it. John 11:35, shortest verse in the Bible, it says Jesus wept. When his friend Lazarus died, Jesus wept. What's even more profound is Jesus knew he would raise him again from the dead very soon after this grief process and this weeping and this crying. He knew he would raise him from the dead. Why is he weeping? Because he still lost something. And in the humanity of who Christ is and was, there was grief experienced, and he expressed it. There's nothing wrong or shameful about being able to weep and grieve loss. So expect it, embrace it, and then work through it. Grief can mature and deepen us and strengthen our character. Psalm 23:4, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. I looked at that in a new way this week, and I'll finish with this thought. I looked at it in a new way this week than I ever had before. My whole experience, I'm like, we go through experiences in life that are they're very dark. And I looked at those dark experiences that I've been through as walking through this valley of the shadow of death. But as I studied this lesson and I incorporated these truths and embraced them and really let them sink in deeper, I've realized one thing. Loss of anything is when we still live, but something else is gone, and we're walking through the valley of the shadow of death. We can see loss, even though it's not my personal loss of life, it's loss of something, and that's part of walking through the valley of the shadow of death. So it's pretty amazing. I will show, this is the last thing I promise. Here we go. Our faith doesn't make us stoic or absolve us from grieving, but rather it gives us a proper and more seasoned and cultivated way to face it. And this became a big discussion, especially for one of the Bible students last night. And that was, there is this facade within Christian communities, and it pervades a lot of Christian communities, that, oh, they're, no crying, no grieving. Oh, they're in a better place. Everything's going great. They're in heaven, and I'm just so happy. It's like, you just lost someone, and you're just expressing all this joy. Now, does God give grace to handle grief? Of course he does. But God gave us the ability to love and appreciate. He also gave us the ability to grieve the loss of those things that we love and the people that we love and appreciate. Why didn't Jesus just say, well, Lazarus is in a better place and he's going to be, No, because Jesus in his humanity was grieving the loss. As a Christian, there's no shame in weeping over the loss of a loved one. There's no shame in that. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13 tells us to not sorrow as those who have no hope. What's interesting is it does not say, and by the way, it's referring to the loss of loved ones, right? People that we know and love that have passed from life to they've passed on. We've laid their bodies to rest. Paul tells the people of Thessalonica, the believers, he doesn't tell them, don't sorrow. He says, don't sorrow like people who have no hope. Sorrow and grieving is a natural part of who we are. We should expect it, and we should embrace the grief, and it deepens us and it strengthens us. And one of the things that was said in Peter Scazzero's book, The Emotionally Healthy Church, and it was very interesting that I had found this earlier this year, reading one of the books I've read so far this year, and that was our grief, when it enters our soul and we embrace it and enlarges us, we actually can handle it, and it grows us, it enlarges us. And he says our spirit is like a balloon, and you fill it up, and a balloon is just a little tiny thing, and you fill it up and it expands. God has created us to be able to allow the grief to sink in and expand, and we expand with it, and we grow from it, and it stretches us to grow us in this area of our life, and it deepens us. It gives us a deeper appreciation for life itself, if nothing else. So embrace the grief that you experience. And we'll get into more life lessons next week, or in 2 weeks from now, because next week I'm doing a prayer at the Capitol. But anyway, thank you for your time. I hope this is a blessing to you. If it is, and you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe. But if nothing else, just thank God for it. We give him all the glory. And of course, share it, maybe on a social media somewhere, because somebody needs to hear these words of truth. God bless.